Hello and welcome to IEMC Radio and Podcast. Today, let's explore the top news headlines. Today, January 17th. We've got a mix of stories. Some pretty heavy, some a bit more hopeful, but all with some interesting angles to consider.
It certainly seems like a day of global happenings, with news spanning continents and touching on everything from international crime to economic trends.
Right. Let's start with a story that unfortunately highlights a growing problem. Elder fraud. A Nigerian national, Okizi Bonaventure Ogbata, has pleaded guilty in the U.S. to running an inheritance scam that targeted hundreds of victims. What's particularly disturbing is that many of these victims were elderly or in some way vulnerable.
It's a reminder that these scams aren't just about stolen money. They're about exploiting trust and preying on people at their most vulnerable. The fact that this scheme was so elaborate, using personalized letters, claiming to represent a Spanish bank, promising these huge inheritances, really underscores the need for awareness and vigilance, especially when it comes to protecting our older generations.
And this wasn't just a small-time operation either. This case involved a whole network of individuals, with 6 others already convicted and sentenced. It makes you wonder how many other scams like this are out there, and how many people are falling victim.
That's a sobering thought. It really highlights the global nature of these crimes and the importance of international cooperation in bringing these perpetrators to justice. Sentences in this case have ranged from 82 to 128 months, which hopefully sends a strong message. But the fight against these types of scams is ongoing.
Absolutely. Switching gears now, let's talk about a story that's generating a lot of discussion in the U.S. President Biden has commuted the sentences of almost 2,500 individuals convicted of nonviolent drug offenses.
This move is interesting because it's directly targeting what many see as disparities in the U.S. criminal justice system. Biden's administration is specifically focusing on individuals serving sentences based on what are now considered outdated laws and sentencing guidelines for drug crimes, particularly those that created a huge discrepancy between crack and powder cocaine offenses.
So it sounds like this is about more than just individual cases. It's about trying to correct what's seen as a systemic problem.
Exactly. It's part of a broader push for criminal justice reform, and it's raising important questions about what true justice looks like. Is it about punishment, or is it about rehabilitation and second chances?
It'll be interesting to see how this unfolds and what impact it has on the larger conversation about drug policy and incarceration in the U.S. Now turning to a story that's truly tragic. Investigators have concluded that bird strikes caused the Jeju Air Boeing 737-800 crash in South Korea last month, a crash which sadly claimed the lives of 179 people.
This incident is a stark reminder of the dangers that wildlife, particularly birds, can pose to aircraft. Even with all the modern technology and safety protocols in place, the pilot reported the bird strikes and was attempting a go-around maneuver, but it wasn't enough. What makes it even more heartbreaking is that air traffic control had actually issued a cautionary advisory about bird activity in the area just minutes before the crash.
It makes you wonder if there's more that could be done to prevent these kinds of accidents, or if there are lessons to be learned about how we respond to potential bird strike situations. Speaking of complex situations, there's been a major development in the ongoing conflict between Israel and Hamas, a ceasefire agreement brokered with the help of Qatar and the U.S.
This is certainly a positive step, especially considering it includes the release of Israeli hostages held by Hamas. However, getting to this agreement wasn't easy. One of the biggest sticking points was the final list of Palestinian prisoners to be released, particularly those considered high-ranking Hamas leaders.
So it sounds like both sides had to make some tough concessions to reach this point. It's probably too early to say what the long-term impact of this ceasefire will be, but hopefully it's a step towards a more lasting peace. Now let's shift our focus to Nigeria, where we see a really interesting economic story playing out. Nigerians living abroad spend over $60 billion, which is about 130 million US dollars, during their visits back home in December 2024.
That's a staggering amount of money. It really highlights the significant economic power of the Nigerian diaspora, especially during what's become known as Deady December, when many Nigerians abroad return home for the holidays.
It's a testament to the strong cultural ties that remain, even across continents. And it raises some intriguing questions about the role of diaspora communities in the economic development of their home countries. Now on a slightly different note, but still related to Nigeria. The UK Prison Service is currently recruiting officers from Nigeria and other countries to address staffing shortages.
It's a fascinating example of how global workforce trends are playing out. However, it seems that some of these new recruits are facing difficulties securing accommodation in the UK. with some even resorting to sleeping in cars or makeshift camps.
That's really concerning. It sounds like there might be a disconnect between the recruitment efforts and the support systems in place to help these new officers integrate smoothly.
Right. There have also been reports of language barriers and other challenges that highlight the importance of not just attracting talent, but also ensuring their well-being and successful integration once they arrive.
It's a reminder that recruitment is only one piece of the puzzle. Now, shifting gears to Canada, there's been a somewhat surprising trend emerging. Almost 50,000 international students who were granted study permits to Canadian universities and colleges failed to show up at their designated institutions.
That's a significant number, and it raises questions about what's going on. Students from Nigeria, India, and China had the highest non-compliance rates, which is particularly interesting.
Is there any sense of what's driving this trend? Is it a change in immigration patterns? Or are there other factors at play?
There's a lot of speculation, but it's a complex issue. Some believe it could be linked to students using study permits as a way to enter Canada, with the intention of then crossing the border illegally into the United States. Others suggest it might be related to difficulties in obtaining visas or financial challenges.
It's a situation that definitely warrants further investigation and raises concerns about the potential for exploitation of the study permit system. Finally, let's turn our attention to Pakistan, where a high-profile court case has reached a verdict. Former Prime Minister Imran Khan has been sentenced to 14 years in prison for corruption. His wife, Bushra Bibi, has also received a 7-year sentence.
This case has been highly contentious from the start, with Khan and his supporters maintaining that the charges, which relate to allegations of accepting land as a gift in exchange for laundered money, are politically motivated.
This verdict is bound to have significant ramifications for Pakistani politics, especially considering Khan remains a very popular figure in the country. It'll be interesting to see how his supporters react and what this means for the stability of the Pakistani government moving forward.
It's a situation that will likely continue to dominate headlines and could potentially lead to further political unrest. What's striking to me, looking at all these stories together, is how many of them touch on the theme of accountability, or the lack thereof.
That's an interesting observation. Can you elaborate on that a bit?
We'll take the inheritance scam, for example. It highlights individuals deliberately taking advantage of vulnerable people for their own personal gain. Then we have the Biden clemency story, which raises questions about whether past sentencing guidelines for drug offenses actually served justice or just perpetuated a cycle of punishment.
It's almost like we're seeing two sides of the same coin. On one hand, individuals exploiting a lack of accountability, and on the other, a system that may itself be failing to uphold accountability in a fair and equitable way.
Exactly. And that theme continues in other stories as well. Think about that tragic plane crash in South Korea. It's prompting questions about whether more could have been done to prevent bird strikes near airports, or whether there were any shortcomings in the response to the pilot's mayday call.
And then we have the situations with the international students not showing up at their designated institutions in Canada, and the Nigerian prison recruits struggling to find suitable accommodation in the UK. Both situations suggest that there may be systemic gaps or oversights that are creating opportunities for exploitation or failing to provide adequate support.
It certainly raises the question of whether these are isolated incidents or symptoms of larger systemic issues. It's like cracks in the foundation, and if we don't address them, they could lead to bigger problems down the line.
So what does all this mean for our listeners? Why should they care about these seemingly disparate stories from around the world?
I think it highlights the importance of critical thinking and engaging with the news on a deeper level. We can't just passively consume headlines and accept things at face value. We need to dig deeper, consider different perspectives, and ask ourselves the tough questions. What are the root causes of these issues? Who benefits and who is harmed? And what can be done to prevent similar situations in the future?
It's about moving beyond just being aware of what's happening and becoming more informed and engaged citizens, right? Because ultimately, accountability starts with each of us.
Absolutely. Whether it's being vigilant against scams, advocating for fairer laws and policies, or simply holding ourselves and those around us to a higher standard, we all have a role to play in creating a more responsible and ethical world.
It's a powerful reminder that we're not just bystanders. We have agency and a responsibility to act. Now, before we wrap up, I have to ask, out of all these headlines we've discussed today, was there anything that particularly surprised or intrigued you?
Honestly, I was really struck by the story about Nigerians living abroad, spending so much money during their visits back home. It's a testament to the deep connection people have to their homeland and the desire to contribute to its economy, even when they live far away.
It's a really heartwarming story. Amidst all the more challenging news we've covered, it speaks to the power of cultural ties and the positive impact that diaspora communities can have. But it also raises some interesting questions, doesn't it?
It certainly does. It makes you wonder how governments can better engage with their diaspora populations, not just economically, but also politically and socially. How can we harness that sense of connection and commitment for the benefit of both the home country and the diaspora community itself?
It's a fascinating dynamic that deserves more attention. I think we've covered a lot of ground today, from international scams to global economic trends, political upheavals, and even bird strikes. It's amazing how seemingly unrelated events can reveal interconnected themes and challenges when you look at them together.
I completely agree. It's like we're piecing together a puzzle, and each headline provides a new clue about the complexities of the world we live in. And that's what makes these conversations so valuable. They allow us to connect the dots, see the bigger picture, and hopefully gain a deeper understanding of the forces shaping our world.
So as we wrap up, is there one thing you'd encourage our listeners to do today to engage more deeply with one of these issues that resonated with them?
I think a great starting point is to look beyond the headlines and seek out diverse perspectives on the topic that piqued their interest. Maybe it's reading an opinion piece from a different political viewpoint, listening to a podcast that delves into the complexities of international student migration, or even just having a conversation with someone who has a different experience or opinion. The key is to challenge our own assumptions and actively broaden our understanding.
That's excellent advice. Thank you for joining us today for this exploration of the news.
It was my pleasure.
And thank you for listening to today's top news headlines on IAMC Radio and Podcast.